today's topic is test coverage outlines, and it will be presented by Stu. Everyone know over here who Stu is. And it has been sponsored by Optimus QA, the local IT testing service company. All right, I hand over to Stu.
Thank you, Ruby. So first question, I guess, is can everyone hear me at the back? Anyone wave at the back if you can hear me okay? I'm not a very loud speaker, so... Anyone wave? Can you hear me okay? Thank you. Someone can. Okay, so as Rumi said, I'm going to talk to you about test coverage outlines. And there's a bit of a credit going out to a couple of people here. So originally these were inspired by something that Jonathan Cole was doing. If you've not heard of the guy, then look him up. He's a very good exploratory tester and now more into the mobile testing. He's Canadian. And we had him in for some training at Sophos, and he was teaching us about exploratory testing and basically give me and a colleague of mine, Jose Artiga, the idea that we could actually develop into what we now call coverage outlines. Yeah? Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to eat the microphone. Okay, so without further ado. So I'm going to make this slightly interactive. I'm going to want a show of hands for the first couple of slides. So how many of you write test cases? I'm assuming a large amount here. Not that many. Okay. How many of you need to repeat test cases? Like run the same test case more than once? Yeah. Not so many hands, which is kind of interesting. And how many of you need to test against different configurations? That could be, browser configurations or hardware configurations or anything else. Okay. And how many of you use a test management system? Not so many for that one.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Fair enough. And how many of you use spreadsheets to track your testing? So there should be a lot more people holding their hands up because there's a lot of people that work with me here. And does anyone use Google Docs or Office 365? Yeah. The people that I work with, okay. All right, so this is what I'm intending to show you tonight. So I'm going to talk about how to structure and simplify your test planning. So I'm going to hopefully help you think about your testing in a much more sort of structured and kind of organized kind of way. And I'm hopefully going to inspire some of your testing as well. So I'm going to help you figure out ways in which you can use coverage outlines to actually inspire the tests that you need to write and need to run. I'm also going to try and encourage you to be test professionals rather than just execution machines, because back to that sort of repeating tests problem. And I'm going to give you some interesting ways in which you can collaborate on testing a little bit more effectively than perhaps you are today. And I'm also going to show you some ways in which you can manage up. So ways in which you can tell your boss, here's where I am, here's what I've still got to do, and kind of here's what risks we still have around, which is the last piece. Basically like what coverage do I need to get versus what do I actually have at this moment in time. I'm sure a lot of you need to do that. So probably can't really see that much, but that's a Google spreadsheet and it's a test coverage outline. I'm just showing you so you get like the overall view, the kind of broad screen view, if you like, of what a coverage outline looks like, and I'm going to drill into the detail. So I promised to talk about structuring and simplifying your plan. So the first thing here is really to focus on the kind of black rows there that are really, they can be areas of testing, or they can be some heuristic that you're wishing to capture test cases under, or anything that makes sense to you, a functional breakdown of your system if you like. The point about it is that you break up the tests in your coverage outline into areas that basically help add structure, help add some organization to your thinking and to your tests. Each row that's white there is basically a test idea, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. And obviously there's a lot more on this screen that you can see, but really the point I'm trying to get across is you kind of break up into sections your test coverage outlines. You're breaking up your testing into different sections. You can also use tabs. And so there's two kind of examples here. One is basically a fairly simple, and I'll show you later, a kind of example sheet where I've got a key which is telling me what my color sort of key is for the test coverage outline. I also use mind maps a lot, so I've got a tab there that's got the mind map on it, and then I've got like different tabs basically talking about sort of different broad scale areas of testing. So again, it's another way to organize your test coverage outline to say, okay, I'm going to break it up into an API producer, API consumer, and I'm also going to have a tab that's going to talk about what assumptions I'm making. The other one is a different kind of style. And what I've done with that one is basically, and actually we've used this recently with Optimus, is to use each tab to record status of testing against a build. Each one of those tabs is a build number. So if you need to test against versions of software or builds of software, that's another way of organizing your testing. You'll note throughout all of this that there is no hard and fast rule to this stuff. It's whatever works for you. So it's a very flexible way of organizing your testing. So the other piece you can do here is you can talk about your coverage. And I've got coverage here in terms of browsers. So I'm talking about my browser and OS combinations there on the top row. And so I'm organizing that I want to get the coverage against each of those browser and OS combinations. It could be that you're testing against different hardware versions, or it could be that you're testing against some third-party version of software that has multiple versions that you need to test against, an interface if you like. Now I've lost my plot. Which one was I going on? Oh yeah, test types. So you can also think about your configurations, if you like, in terms of test types. So I can also use this to say I've got coverage on valid query parameters at the unit test level. I could also be writing SpecFlow, which, if anyone doesn't know what that is, it's basically a BDD test automation tool for C#. So I could write automation at the SpecFlow level that covers valid query parameters, and I could have both of those, right? I could have unit test coverage and I could have SpecFlow automation test coverage. And lastly there, I could actually have a contract test that the consumer of my API has given me to test in my CI system. So I've got coverage there too. And you've got multiple ways of actually prioritizing your testing. So here I've got a vertical column, and I have to admit this is one of those where me and Jose didn't actually come up with the vertical column priority. That was something that the folks that I work with at Sophos actually come up with. Some of them are probably in this room. And I've just used simple color there to highlight the high, medium, low type priority. So I've got a slightly darker color for the high, so I'm saying that those test ideas on those rows are the higher priority tests that you need to run. So in other words, you can organize your testing and sort of talk to priorities of your testing and say, I'm going to test the highest priority things first, hopefully fairly obviously, and then you're going to say that these next set of tests are more medium priority, so if I don't get to them, it's less of an issue. And you've got another way, you've got like 2 dimensions of prioritization, because the other thing I do here is I prioritize by config in terms of left to right. So the browsers in this case are prioritized where the first column that has a browser in it, a browser configuration in it, is my highest priority. So I want to be able to test with, in this case, Windows XP and i8 first. For anyone who does any browser testing, you realize that's probably one of the worst browsers you can test with. Well, go any older than i8 and you'll get even worse. But you know, in terms of the ones that you see there, it's definitely the one that's going to expose the most bugs. So the point about this is you would effectively be looking to fill in your coverage outline, you run your tests and effectively record the status in the coverage outline in terms of priority in the kind of top to bottom, high to medium to low type priority in the vertical column, and also in the left to right kind of way. Sorry for anyone that's kind of speaking Hebrew or Arabic, but left to right is kind of conventional for me. I mentioned earlier a key, and it's really simple. It's just these are the colors that I use, and basically the way this works is, if any of you played around with this in Excel or in Google Docs or anything similar, you can do conditional formatting. What that means is you can set up the color code, so you say, okay, if I put a P in this column or in this cell, sorry, that you'll actually color that green. And what that means is you get this very, very instant effect that you can see all across your coverage outline of, have I got more green than red, for example? Have I got more passes than fails? Or have I got some horrible yellows in there, which means that I'm blocked and I've got some problems that someone else needs to help me fix? And of course then, the starting point for most people is you end up with a lot of blue, which is the to-do kind of bit, which is like, I've got this plan, but I haven't actually executed anything yet. And I talked a bit earlier about the prioritization piece there, so hopefully that makes sense too. And that's really the color coordination in, glorious detail, if you like. So we've got examples of each one here. The X I didn't really talk about, but the X is almost as important as anything else. Actually, I've made a mistake there because I haven't actually got anything in the test row there, but if you look at the X on the max query parameters, what I'm really saying by having an X in there is that I am intentionally not going to cover this. And that this is that row matrixed into that column. So it's important to tell people what you're not planning to test as much as it is that you are planning to test something, especially if they want to tell you you're wrong. So I also kind of talked about inspiration. Well, I use mind maps a lot because I'm quite a visual person, so can't really see that very clearly, but basically this is the mind map that drove my UI page test coverage outline example. And so you can possibly make out that I've got a few colors in there, and then there's a sort of a third level of detail breaking out my kind of thinking. And I just use mind maps to help me think, but lists work for a lot of people too, so you don't have to use a mind map, you can just use the kind of list view of the coverage outline. So I talked a bit about sort of having areas of focus called out by those kind of black lines, but actually when you do that, when you actually sort of start and you say, okay, I'm going to put this area of focus in here, and maybe it's, I don't know what was the example I had earlier, but if you just think of like something you're looking at focusing on, it could be a functional area, so it could be something like saying, okay, I've got this feature where I basically, I don't know, pick the users that I'm going to send an email to. And then you could say, okay, my user picker, or whatever you want to call that piece of functional area, you can actually have that as a headline. And if you don't do anything else, you've just sort of given yourself a starting point to think about, okay, what do I want to test under that? You're kind of giving yourself a headline to work with. I quite often use heuristics. So, fallible guides to thinking about testing of a certain type. So I might use the simple heuristic of performance. Okay, what do I think about performance? What should I cover for performance? I'm just looking at Robert right now, but I'm thinking localization, right? So if I want to, think about what do I need to cover under this particular thing for localization? What matters about localization for this? And then I'll be able to inspire myself to come up with test ideas underneath that. I've already mentioned that I actually create templates with this stuff. So I use templates to help other people sort of get off the ground or sort of get thinking or get started thinking about test design. So if you have a template, which like I said, I'll show you later, I have a template for a UI page. It's a really simple template. That was what the mind map was earlier. And it just is some structure that if you just look at it and think about you're testing a UI page, it'll help you think about the tests that you need to run against that UI page, hopefully. So I mentioned, and I don't mean any insult by this, by the way, that I'm going to sort of help you be test professionals. So what I mean by that is there are an awful lot of people in our field of work that end up kind of doing a factory type job where someone else is designing all the tests, and then they're giving you a set of tests to run that are very prescriptive, that are very detailed, very step by step, and then they're basically saying, okay, I want you to run these more than once, probably several times for every build. And it will drive you nuts unless you're really, really into that kind of thing. So Boris Bezier, who's a quite famous but very old, and like me, very old, I guess, guy that's been around in testing for a long time. So again, if you don't know him, look him up. He's very famous for black box testing. Come up with this phrase that's pesticide paradox, which is a great phrase, and it really talks about the idea that if you run the exact same test with the exact same detailed steps repeatedly, you're not going to find new bugs. You really aren't. It's the same problem you have with a crop. If you keep spraying it with the same pesticide every year, the bugs get resilient to the pesticide and your crop gets eaten, which is hence the phrase. So using test ideas really is that sort of that key thing to say, okay, it's just a top line idea. It's just like a one-liner, just one sentence, a few words, and it's just to say, I'm going to cover something like this. Not, I'm going to do exactly these steps, but I'm just going to think about that thing and I'm going to test something around that. And that encourages what I call brain-engaged testing. It also encourages exploration. Now, if anyone's done any sort of formal exploratory testing, you can do things like test charters or test tours, depending on whether you listen to James Back or whether you're more of Elizabeth Hendrickson kind of fan. And what you can do with a coverage outline is you can actually have a test charter or a test tour being either your section area, or it could actually be your test idea. You could keep it that high level if you wanted to, and I've done that before. I should have said at the beginning, but I'll take questions at the end, if that's okay. So if you've got questions about anything I'm saying along, try and save them for the end. I also mentioned I'd help collaborate on testing. Well, one of the reasons why I asked about Google Docs or Office 365 is because they're basically online and very, very shareable. I have a personal preference for Google Docs. My company unfortunately has a preference for 365, but I'm still hanging on to using Google Docs. And really what you can do with this, and so simply, and obviously with Google Docs it's free as well, is you just sort of say, if you've got a testing team and you've got 8 browsers to cover, or 8 browser versions mixed with operating systems to cover, just allocate the browser columns to 8 different people. And so you work on that one, you work on that one, you work on that one. It's dead easy. And because it's real time, you can each update that spreadsheet and you'll see the results that each other's getting. And you see if someone else fails a test and they're ahead of you, then you might sort of say, oh, well, I'm probably going to fail the same test if it's something that's likely to be exposed in each browser. So you can kind of get ahead of the game, and you can also see where everyone's at, and your boss, if he's interested, can see where everyone's at too, and see who's the slow person and who's the fast person. So you can encourage some competition using that too. But you can do exactly the same thing with sections, right? So you can allocate a section per person or per team even, or whatever. And you can allocate tabs if you've done it that way. So if you've organized your tabs to be sort of more logical or functional areas, you could allocate, say, I want you to do, I think the example I gave earlier was I want you to do the API producer test, and maybe someone else wants to do the API consumer test, for example. So it's very easy to collaborate, and it's very easy to see the results of collaboration pretty much in real time if you're using Google Docs. And I talked about managing up. So most of us have that problem of someone actually wants to know what results, what the results are of what we're doing, and they typically want that when they want it, and not necessarily when you want to give it to them. So to save you a lot of time of having to scramble around and create a status report, well, you can just show them this, right? And you can show them how to get to it anytime they want to get to it, so they don't have to bug you and kind of send you an email or tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, where are you at with that testing? Or worse, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? So you can see that I've just given some stupid examples here in terms of color coding, but you can see that, okay, we've got no problems with Windows XP and IE8. It's a complete lie, obviously, but we've got some failures under Win8.1 and IE11, which actually was a reality for one of the teams here, and we had some blocks, and we deliberately said we're not going to test Windows 7 on Firefox on Windows 7 even. So you're very clearly communicating status to anybody to say, okay, here's the stuff that's failed, here's the stuff that's blocked, and here's the stuff that I have no intention of covering. And like I said, this is kind of real time, right? So you don't have to do a lot of work to put this status report together. It just happens as you do your testing. So you get an easier life, and actually your boss gets an easier life too. No surprise why I'm talking about this, right? So the plan versus actual piece is just a subtle variant on that, which is that I plan to, so I've got some to-dos in here, to cover the testing of Windows 7 IE11 on those 2 test ideas. I haven't done it yet. It's quite clear that I haven't done it yet because there's a blue still in there. And there's some more on the other piece below. So I've gone through this very quickly, haven't I? So, questions. Did I show you how to structure and simplify your test planning? Did I inspire anybody? Did I teach you how to be test professionals and not just execution machines? Did I show you how to collaborate on testing or show clear and concise status? I guess I just did. And I didn't talk about risk actually. So the other piece of this is when you know that you haven't covered something, you know that there's risk in not covering that thing. So you know that any test that you haven't run or anything that you intended to run but haven't run, I should say, plan versus actual, is a risk. But this gives you a great way of not only articulating it, but having a conversation around it and saying, well, I deliberately didn't plan on covering, let's just step back, the Firefox on Windows 7. And someone could say, well, why weren't you worried about that? Well, you can actually have a conversation as to why you're not worried about that. Maybe you've got a good reason, and maybe you just didn't have time, and you can tell them that's the reason why you didn't plan on covering it, because you didn't think there was enough time. But you can also say, well, actually out of the columns you can see there, it's the fourth column to the right, so actually it's the lowest priority out of all the browser configurations. So maybe that was why I deemed it, like I'd already made the decision that it was the lowest risk in terms of configuration, so me not testing it makes a lot of sense, right? So if you've already set the expectation that that's the way your test coverage outline is organized, then you know that that's why you're not going to cover it. Things to watch for. So if you're in the habit of writing really, really detailed test cases and test specifications, then classically what you're going to do when you start trying to use test coverage outlines is you're going to try and do the same thing in a spreadsheet, and it won't work. And you obviously can review each other's spreadsheets here and say, what the hell? You've got 20 lines of text in this one row that's meant to tell me a test idea, and instead you're telling me exactly what I need to do. It's always a bad idea. Sheets getting too large, which is where you just keep needing to spin that scroll wheel down, see more and more and more tests coming. Or you have to go right the way over to the right because you've got like 1,500 configurations you're trying to cover. Don't do that. Break it up in either areas and sections in terms of the kind of black line kind of thing, or use tabs. Right, so just break up areas of testing into tabs. And it just makes it easier for people to consume, but it also makes it easier for you to work on. If you start working on a sheet that's just way too large, it'll drive you nuts. Obviously, if you get too many tabs, you get the same sort of problem. If you're having to actually sort of, use the kind of tab navigation thing to get around your tabs, then you've probably got too many. And I've seen this happen a few times as well, where people start adding all sorts of different colours. You kind of get like mad rainbows happening where, oh, well, I want to record that this was planned but wasn't done because so-and-so was sick or something. Or, you just get kind of crazy things going on where people try and communicate way too much. Keep it simple, the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid, definitely goes well with this. Another one I've seen is that kind of classic problem with the manage up. Well, I want figures. I don't want to just look at a sheet and see that I've got mostly green and not a lot of red. I actually want percentages. I want, how much percentage coverage have we got so far and all this kind of stuff. Well, you can get carried away with that stuff too, because as soon as you start adding formulas and trying to get clever with this, then you start losing the flexibility of being able to add very easily, very cheaply, very quickly, new rows, new sections, new tabs, whatever, because all of a sudden now you've got a formula that's tied to that thing and it's going to break as soon as you do that, and then you've got to go and maintain the formula and yada yada. There you go. That did seem rather quick, but questions? Happens to be 5 whys, which is something else I'll probably talk about at some point. Yeah.
How do you combine automation with manual testing here, or is this you don't really care as long as it's pass, fail, or block?
Okay, so the question is, how do I combine automation and manual? So I'm actually just going to flip you to one of the examples. I don't know which one's the better one to show you here, but let's just do this. Why isn't that giving me the presentation option? I guess because it's not a presentation. Can you see that clearly enough? So what I've got there, and I kind of went through this in one of the earlier slides, is column C there is actually talking about unit tests. Now, I don't know if you're a bit of a crazy team, but unit tests are generally automated. So that will be showing that you've got coverage that's automated coverage at the unit test level. And then I kind of mentioned briefly spec flow, but any type of automation, whether it's kind of just hand rolled, your company's done your own version of automation, you can just have a column or multiple columns if you've got different types that basically say I've got coverage using this automation at this level. So for the stupid example I've got here, I've got valid query parameters, so I could have a unit test that's basically testing the bit of code that does validation around query parameters at the unit level. Then I could have a spec flow automation test, which might be more at the API level, because this is talking about a REST API, that's basically saying, okay, I'm expecting that if I provide you with valid query parameters, I'm going to get a valid HTTP header back and perhaps a body string that tells me that, yes, I'm echoing back what you gave me and it was valid. Any more?
So as you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So
Totally.
So when a test fails, do you have any tips on how to include screenshots in the test coverage outline?
Yeah, it's a good one actually. So I didn't cover that in my talk at all, but let me just flip tabs here. Get away.
So can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So the question was, any ideas about how you might include something like a screenshot? So like if you've got a failed test, oh, come on. If you've got a failed test, how would you actually sort of show that detail? And what I tend to have is this comments column. And like if you have a failed bug, then I would expect to see something in the comments column, and it might be a link to the bug itself, which may or may not include the screenshot that you've just kind of pulled in. So it's like the drill down detail, if you like. So if I've got something red in my sheet, so maybe you've got the first so sort of Windows 7 IE9, maybe that one's red. In fact, let's just make it red. Let's just do what I'm saying. And this is how simple it is, by the way. So there's the conditional formatting coming in. So then I've got this failed test, and you know, if I'm Robert's boss and I'm kind of looking over his shoulder or looking at the sheet from my desk, and I'm saying, oh, he's just failed that. Why has he failed that? I don't see anything in the comments column telling me why he's failed that. Or maybe he just needs to type that, bug ID 123. Or maybe he's talking about a failure that isn't in a manual test or an exploratory test, but it's in some automation code, in which case maybe you want to link to where the automation code lives, or to the build report that just showed you that failed because it's in your CI system. You could, of course, put a screenshot in here, but you can imagine how quickly that would get very large.
You could have a worksheet just for screenshots.
You could have a worksheet for screenshots. In fact, I didn't bring this example, but I have another one. Actually, I could open it up, but it's quite proprietary. So there's quite often a case where you have a sheet or multiple sheets in your coverage outline that is actually the kind of model or the architectural diagram or the data flow diagram or whatever it is of the thing you're trying to test. So sorry, just repeating what Robert said. He said you could actually have a sheet in here that includes the screenshots.
How do you manage revision histories here?
On the document itself, we don't care. Its current history is what you care about. So I guess if you're thinking about in terms of like a version of the software that you're testing against, then it's back to that idea that I explained earlier about using the tabs for builds, for example. Just flip back to that.
Tab would be like a build. But let's say if multiple team members are working on the same build and testing and using the same sheet.
Yep.
And by mistake, if someone has made some changes, or
you can actually roll back things in Google Docs. So the question is really if someone makes a change that was unintentional or erroneous in some way, you can actually roll back revisions in Google Docs. It's not perfect, like most software. Sometimes it doesn't work, especially if you've got a lot of collaborators. It can break you. But yeah, generally speaking, what I would do with this kind of stuff is you use. Sorry, I can actually present this one, can I? I'd use tabs for versions of product or build. And if you really are sensitive about that kind of stuff, then what you could actually do is you could, when you're doing that collaborative kind of thing, you'd actually make a copy of the sheet and say, well, you work on that column, but in that sheet, kind of thing. And you could call the sheet, Stuart, and then have another one that's rootmeat, and then we could, have our own kind of sheet that does that. And Google's a little bit better about rolling back revisions if you screw something up. But generally speaking, what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, I've run these tests against something. And if that something is more or like too hard to sort of cover in terms of like a configuration column, then you might want to say it's like this, this is per build, right? So I've actually passed or failed X amount of tests on this build number, and then I've rerun the same tests on this next build number. Could be version 1, version 2, could be whatever it is for you. I sense another question coming. No?
I think so. So Stu, how do I know which are the tests that I have to run for my smoke testing?
You could have a smoke testing column and say these are the smoke tests, and that's my coverage at smoke test level.
So if I go to the priority and you have high, medium and low, how do I know which I select for my BBT test? Because if it's a high, doesn't matter, if it's a high, that
Yep.
could not be like a smoke
Yep.
test. So
Okay, so the question here is that if you've got something like a BVT or a smoke test,
Yeah.
how would you organize it? And I guess this is as good as any other to look at. So you've got this kind of idea that you've got a vertical priority. Now, first thing I'd mention is you don't have to use that. That's just an idea, right?
Yeah,
But you can also consciously override that for a column. So if you wanted to have a column that says, this is my BVT coverage, and I also have coverage of the same test idea later on in a manual way or in an automated way at some other layer,
Yeah.
you could have those columns as being your configurations, and then just know that you need to ignore the priority for the BVT because they're all equal priority. And generally speaking, when you talk about automated tests, they are equal priority because generally speaking, you don't just run them selectively, you just run your automation. Right? If it's a CI system, you're generally running everything. So the priority is meaningless for that. The priority really comes into play when it's a manual, like effort. Someone has to spend time physically doing something.
Yeah.
But equally, you could say, I've got a tab that's BVT. And so there is no priority column in the BVT thing, it's just showing me the results of the BVT. But I would argue that if your BVT is automated, why do you need this?
Yeah.
To show you the results of
Of
it,
course.
right?
Yeah.
It's only if you're doing a manual smoke test or a manual BVT that you actually want to have this kind of thing, in which case the priority of it does come into play.
Yeah.
So I've just talked myself out of the answer I gave you, but...
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, I asked the question for this case,
Yeah.
but I know that.
Yeah. So like I said, I'll say it again,
Yeah.
like a lot of people get trapped into this idea that whenever I provide templates for an example, that everyone
Yes.
tries to follow exactly the same thing and trying to fit their own mental model into this kind of
Yeah.
thing. And what I'm saying is, at the end of the day, it's a spreadsheet. You can do what the hell you like with it.
Yeah.
And you can go nuts with it. And that's why I kind of had that slide about like what to watch for, because people do go nuts with it and then get into trouble. So keep it simple, stupid.
Steve?
Yep.
And how can you value and count the time spent on specific tasks? Count the time.
That's a good question. I never do. No, not really. Because I normally have other systems that help me with that, right? So, like if you're using any kind of, like a bug tracking system, or we use Mingle for story cards and bugs, we can actually track the time that card transitions. So you can have a lead time on a story or a bug and actually tell, the time the bug was raised, the time it was resolved and tested, or the time the story was kind of brought into development and then tested, started testing and then finished testing. And it's not here. You could, if you wanted to, you could actually put a time column in here, and you could sort of either put estimated and then have another column that says actual and map to that and do results off the back of that.
The time is like the time that the time of human effort.
Yeah. So you're asking, how do I put time in there to plan, presumably, to say I think this test will take me 5 minutes to run, or it will take me 2 days to run.
Yes.
Well, that's making it more of a planning tool than a coverage outline tool, but yeah, you can do that too. You could have, a planned time column against your tests. You can graph it, you can get really carried away with all sorts of formula that work out, your actual versus your planned and your break-even points and all that sort of crazy stuff. I mean, you're starting to get into the kind of agile burn-down chart at that point.
How frequently would you need to reset this sheet or start over? Is there
There's no rule to how often you need to reset the sheet or start over. That's up to you.
just in your experience, when does it become too much information in one sheet and you should start new one?
When I get annoyed with scrolling, typically. And obviously everyone has their own sort of subjective kind of level to that, because there's some people in this room that have created sheets that I find really annoying to scroll through, but they're quite obviously happy with them. But again, it depends, right? So if you're trying to think about how often do I reset the sheet in terms of how often do I move from this build or this version to the next one, then that's a choice that only you and your team make in terms of, when do I say I've done enough testing on this one and I should move on to the next build? Maybe it's when the next build arrives, but maybe it's when you've covered a certain amount of things. You plan that kind of switch point, if you like, into it. If you're talking about like just sheer size, just like how big is this sheet, then like I said, I just generally use the annoyance factor. And you'll go by the weakest link on the team. So the person who gets annoyed first, you'll get used to finding out who that person is, and you use them as your test. Any more? I'm here all night. No? We done? No?
The idea to use test ideas
Mm-hmm.
against vestitive paradox trap is very little. But at the same time, when how would you assure that attempters will run using this idea understood the ideas itself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what we're talking about here is the pesticide paradox and the fact that I'm encouraging everyone to use a very high-level test idea. And how can you be sure, how can you test, if you like, your colleagues to say they've understood that idea and they're testing it appropriately? Simple answer is you can't. Not without talking to them, not without like asking them what they did, that kind of stuff. And that really comes from building trust and rapport with each other in terms of a test team or an agile team. And it also comes from that sort of, you don't necessarily use this straight away with new person on the team, right? You have to kind of get to that point where you can actually trust them with that by pairing with them and doing it, or pairing with them on exploratory, or pairing with them on the manual test. Automation, not so bad, right? Because automation actually by its very nature is specified and kind of, rigorous in the sense that it will do exactly the same thing every time. Unless you've introduced randomness into that, of course. So the interesting thing about the pesticide paradox and kind of not doing the same thing each time, of course, is with each of these test ideas, the assumption is that you're not going to remember exactly what you did last time, or that you're going to have thought differently, more, or learned something new since the last time you run this test, in which case you're going to do it slightly differently. But you can still get into the pesticide paradox trap, because you can be one of those people who says, oh, I remember how I did this test last time, I'll just do it the same way again. I'll use exactly the same values or parameters or permutations or whatever it is. The same variability as I used last time, I'll use it again. And you're not getting any better by doing that, but that's why I'm going to try and encourage you to be a test professional and consciously think about that. Consciously try to do something different each time. Try to stretch your imagination. Try to challenge yourself and say, well, okay, I did this last time. I didn't find anything new, so let's try something else. Or let's try playing around with this page while I've got Fiddler open and I can see what it's actually talking to the server with, and maybe I spot something there that's unexpected. It's nothing really related to the test idea you had, but it actually is another bit of information that you're getting while you're doing a test. Does that answer your question? Any more?
Just a comment, actually, if you are stuck on something and you're trying to test and don't understand the test idea, that's the beat one.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, just highlight the beat, especially if you're working in a team, you're collaborating with others. They can see that you're blocked, and someone else can come along and say, hey, I noticed you're blocked, Jim. So what's the problem? Can I help you with that? That's a good idea. Okay. Oh, one more.
Block normally is blocked, right? The feature is not implemented. But
Sometimes it could be that you can't test something because maybe some infrastructure isn't available for you to test, or if you're looking at, say, well, I'll keep talking about this one, but maybe you don't have your Windows XP i8 machine because actually it's broken because it's a really old rubbish operating system and it's just not maintainable.
But if you don't understand, right? Don't understand how to test or something, you should make it clear.
But you could. I mean, what I'm saying is you could use that as a trigger.
Sorry,
That
I just different.
yeah, no, but you do use it whichever way you want, right? I mean, what Jim's suggesting there is just an idea, a way of using it. You don't have to use it that way, of course.
It should be skipped, right? Because I don't know how to test it.
Maybe.
Skip it.
And if you wanted to, you could add that color.
If one more color, I would.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. But it's up to you, right? And your team and what works for you. Like I said, this isn't prescriptive. I am, you probably guessed, not really into prescriptive testing. Any more?
What measurements
Oh,
help you in test design?
what measurements help me? So what are you, okay, so what are we really asking here? So what measurements help me in test design? What?
Indicators do you use to figure out how good is test design?
How good is the test design, or how much coverage have I got?
It depends.
Or which are you asking? So how good is my test design? I mean, like that's really saying, have I thought of everything I could have thought of? Is that what you're asking? I use heuristics a lot. So, I use kind of other people's great thinking to guide my thinking, right? So I will use a lot of things, and there's probably a lot of people in this room that will groan at when I mention something I call risk analysis, which is basically this very, very long collection of different lists of heuristics. And it's my way of actually forcing everyone to think about all these different things. And it's a systematic approach. It's not the only one, it's just the one that I prefer to use. And again, the reason I use that is because heuristics they're fallible, but they're inspirational in the sense that, you ask 10 people in the same room, what do you think when I say performance, and you'll get 10 completely different answers. And the point about that is they're not all wrong answers, it's just they're different answers. And maybe you need to actually consider every single one of those 10 different answers. But if you use some other form that just says you always need to do this type of test, then you're just constraining yourself to, I always need to do that type of test. If you use something that's just high level and kind of like an idea, a one line or a one word even, that inspires you to think about something, and you think about that something in the context of whatever it is you're trying to prove. So performance in terms of a UI page, which is the example I was using, versus performance in terms of an API, or in terms of a service that you're exposing to a customer, they're very different things. So, I could say every time you're talking about performance of a UI page, you need to consider this, but it's just constraining your thinking, and it's taking me more time then to say, that's what I mean for a UI page, and then I've got to prescribe what it means for a service, I've got to prescribe what it means for an API. If I just use a heuristic and say, think about performance, and think about it in the context of whatever it is you're testing.
One thing I'm thinking about is risk analysis.
Yeah.
So can this kind of thing help, or there's some kind of conflict to help you write the...
That's a really difficult one for you to answer for most of the folks here who don't know what we mean when we talk about risk analysis. But the question was really, how can this help with risk analysis, or how can you use it with risk analysis? Well, I mentioned that I had this really long list of heuristics, and maybe this is another talk I should give at some other point, about how to analyze risk, or kind of areas in which code or design or architecture can fail whenever you're talking about a story, a feature, a piece of the product, whatever it is. And really the way I would use that in this context is you can use the very same heuristics that I use for risk analysis to inspire your test ideas. And so if you're in that situation where you're not involved in the design process, so you can't prevent someone writing that bad code that's going to introduce the bug, then you can actually just record the heuristics that I use for risk analysis in a coverage outline, and then you're making sure that you effectively do something which I don't like doing, which is test the quality in by actually doing it after the fact, right? So you've got the code delivered to you, now you go through these kind of list of heuristics, and you kind of come up with test ideas against those heuristics that you then execute against the product, the feature, the story, and then you hopefully find out all the things that got coded in that you could have avoided coding in by doing analysis with the team up front when they were designing the code. Does that help? Sort of.
I think another indicator, going back to his question, another indicator that I use in my test design, I go back in the defect management system, and I go back 1 year, 2 years, 3 years ago, and I see what kind of problems they dealt with them before. It doesn't have to be a defect. Exactly, in the software could be a problem in the network, or an issue, different issues, requirements issues, or
Yeah, so one of the things I actually use, what you're talking about here, is use bug history.
bug history, yeah, or problems history.
Domain history.
Yeah.
So your experience with the product, or your bug experience with the product to guide your testing. One of the things on my risk analysis sheet is actually that, is using what you know, either from things that have failed in the past or things that customers have complained about in the past, but also what you've experienced, the classic, there's only one way to ever find these kind of things, is it's pure experience that when someone changes code over here, something over here breaks.
That's exactly right.
Like no one knows why, no one can figure out what that dependency is, but
Yeah.
you know it because you've experienced it more than once
Right.
and you've remembered that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there are configurations, test environment configurations that sometimes you get a bug, you have a problem because the configurations are not done. And it takes 3 or 4 days to the team. You know exactly where to test,
Yep.
what to design, so you can touch that area where you get that error page or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I use all kind of things like this.
Yeah.
Internal issues, client issues, all.
Well, you kind of heard me talk about this earlier, where I've got a bit bug history and perhaps a little bit of a bias towards
Yeah.
not ever trying to support IE8, but it's that kind of thing, right? We all know it's buggy, so that's an
Exactly.
area of focus.
Yeah.
Right? So.